Hi there, sweet mommies. This is Sherry Hayes with MomDelights.com. I'm the mom of 15 children, and today we're going to dive into babies and especially the slimy, grimy history of reproductive manipulation. So go ahead and sweep the floor and dry the dishes and comb the husband's hair, whatever you need to do while we dive into the good life in Jesus. So we've been doing this series, right? We've been talking about having babies, and like I said, I'm the mom of 15, so I've had a lot of experience with having babies. Some people would say too much experience. I believe I have earned the right to be heard on this subject, right? Okay, today we're going to go over, like I said, the slimy, grimy history. And I tell you what, it's pretty dark and pretty ugly. Okay, in the first podcast of this series, I explained that this is going to be a part of a whole unit study. We're just studying babies. We're studying every aspect from, we laid the foundation that we need more babies because our population is decreasing all over the world, okay? And then we talked about the population myth, how really there's no such thing as a population bomb, except that the decline of people could be a population bomb, but in the opposite of what most people think, right? So we talked about that. And that was like podcast 2 and 3 in this series. And I've got to make a playlist. Okay. Now, today we're going to talk about the history. Okay. Now we went over a lot of different things. We also introduced a person by the name of Reverend Thomas Malthus, and we're going to talk about him more today. Okay, now there is a disclaimer for today's podcast, and that is this podcast deals with mature issues and is not suitable for children. So it's probably not a good idea that you play this out loud where your kids can hear it, with the earbuds in, right? Or when you have a few moments alone, which you might not have any, but I'm just saying you need to listen to this when kids aren't around, especially little kids. Now, your older kids, maybe your teens, maybe they need to hear this message because they're probably not going to hear too much of it anyplace else. Okay, now let's begin at the beginning. Now, we're talking about reproductive manipulation, remember. Okay, so I know we've heard a lot recently about reproductive rights. I mean, that just seems to be the catchphrase that people are using. But we're going to talk about reproductive manipulation. That's what we're going to call it, okay? Now, the first recorded instance of reproductive manipulation was in the Bible. Okay, specifically in Genesis 38, verses 6 through 10. Okay, I will read it to you. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, that's his brother, sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the child would not be his, so whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from providing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death also. Now, okay, we know that Onan incurred God's wrath because he did not want to give his brother offspring, not necessarily because he spilled his semen. I mean, you can put those two together, but I think it's drawing too much of a connection to say that it was just because he spilled his semen. I don't think that's true. I think that it's because he was being selfish, all right? So we can easily brush off the brother needing to give his brother offspring. We can brush that off because that was cultural, okay? And we can say, oh, this is irrelevant to today. There's nothing to add to our discussion about reproductive manipulation because that was a cultural setting that we don't experience today. But is it really true? I mean, at the core of Onan and his reproductive manipulation is this. Okay, and it's in 1 John 2:16. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world. Okay, this, my dears, is the root of all reproductive manipulation. And it is traced back to the tempter himself when he declared, I will be like the Most High. And when he tempted Eve with, you will not certainly die, The serpent said to the woman, "For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." And that's Genesis 3, 4 through 5. So the hook here is, you will be like God. And besides selfishness, a lot of reproductive manipulation has really that core to it. The pride of man is like, I will be like the Most High. I will have control in this part of my life. All right. Many of us believe, okay, we want to be like God. We think we are like God. We believe that the fate of human life lies in our hands. And it does. We have choices, right? Many of us believe this is our right, and we have the ability to harness human reproduction for the good, quote unquote, of mankind. All right, so this is when you get to be an elitist and you can like do some planning and think, well, the best thing for the world is to have this, that, or the other thing. Like right now, it's like to reduce the population, reduce the surplus population. Remember, I read to you that quote from Dickens' Christmas Carol, where he talks about it. You know, Scrooge talks about that Malthusian idea that there is a surplus population that the world cannot sustain. Therefore, we need to encourage the demise of a certain amount of people. All right, so there is that thing in people's minds that they are like God and they can decide what is good and what is right according to their own rationality, their own thinking. Okay. Now, but when we learn the darkness surrounding this idealistic thinking, we have to question it. There's just so much darkness surrounding all this type of thought. For example, besides Onan's selfishness, all forms of contraception and procreative manipulation in ancient history were linked to paganism. Okay? Eber's papyrus recorded the induction of abortion via pessaries. And that was in like 1500 BC, I believe it was. The other cultures practiced extreme physical exertion and of the mother, and vaginal poultices, which were made of wads of cotton or wool soaked in poisonous solutions, and they had all kinds of other stuff. And then there was infanticide. So reproductive manipulation is not new. We've made it kind of clinical in this last century, and we think we have all the science down, but people have been doing this thing for a long time. Okay, infanticide, that's a big one. The Bible records pagan practices of passing one's son, quote, through the fire, unquote. You know, when they had the statue of Molech and they would heat up this huge fire around this statue until the arms were like glowing red, you know, and then they would put the child in the arms of this statue so that it could be burned to death. And the child, of course, would be screaming in pain. So they would beat drums really loudly to cover the cries. Isn't that awful? Isn't that horrible? I told you it was slimy and grimy. Okay. Now, God, of course, thought it was horrible. And he definitely told them over and over again how he hated that. He absolutely hated it. Okay, and there was judgment that happened because people did that. Then there was the Greek play Oedipus Rex. And that's in Greek culture. And it includes Oedipus' mother deciding to have her infant's foot nailed to a hillside and left to die of exposure to the elements and wild beasts. That was when I first heard of Oedipus Rex, I thought, well, that's crazy. I never knew that this was very common in those ancient cultures to do this with your child if you didn't want it. In this instance, Oedipus' mother went to a soothsayer who said that her child was going to murder his own father and marry his mother, right? So she said, well, we're not going to have anything of that. So they had the child taken, and his foot was nailed to a hill, and he was left to the elements and the wild beasts. But a shepherd came by and saved his life, and he went on to murder his father and marry his mother. But anyway, you'll have to read that sometime. Maybe you don't want to. I don't care. Anyway, ancient Romans practiced oral contraception and abortion. Yeah, they like drank poison. It's awful. But infanticide was quite common. Okay, it was the patriarch who decided whether to keep or expose a newborn, and it was called exposing. The 12 tables of Roman law required the death of visibly deformed children. It was law that you had to murder a child if it was deformed. And malformed infants were usually killed immediately after birth. Of course, not every Roman participated in this. Lots of them raised their malformed children, but it was the law of the time. But I'm not sure what part of the Roman Empire that was, but it was part of the law that you couldn't have a malformed child. Okay, archaeologists examining the ruins of Pompeii found numerous infant skeletons in a sewer downstream from a brothel. Okay, so that's because when the prostitute would get pregnant, she would consequently either they would abort the baby or she would give birth, and lots of these skeletons were full-term skeletons. They would just toss the baby in the sewer. All right, I'm telling you, it's sad. It's horrible. Okay, infanticide continued into the early Middle Ages, supposedly practiced on a gigantic scale. Even after the fall of Rome, people were practicing infanticide. It was Christianity that made the difference. The transformational power of Jesus began working in the hearts of men, and Tertullian himself railed against pagans and their treatment of the sick in the 2nd century. Okay, that's like 100 something AD. Also in the 2nd century, the Didache, also known as the Lord's teaching through the 12 apostles to the nations, included a condemnation of abortion, as did the Apocalypse of Peter, written during the same period. Okay, so they were against it. Early church fathers opposed procreative manipulation in all forms. Among these were Hippolytus of Rome, Clement of Alexandria, Augustine of Hippo, John Chrysostom, and Jerome. Some went as far as to, okay, so this is a quote from Jerome. Some go as far as to take potions that they may ensure barrenness, and thus murder human beings before their conception. So Jerome had the idea that God had wanted children to be conceived even, and people prevented that, and that was like murder. That was Jerome. Okay. Augustine of Hippo, in the book On Marriage and Concupiscence, said concerning lust without procreation, couples use the respectable name of marriage to cover a shame. Sometimes this lustful cruelty or cruel lust comes to this, that they use sterilizing drugs. So see, we had sterilizing drugs way back then. All right, and the church fathers were against it. Okay, it was the first Council of Nicaea in 325 that began a shift in thinking and practice. After this, the church created brephotrophes for exposed infants. So they would rescue these exposed infants, and they would raise them then in safety. Okay, as well as orphanages. They didn't have orphanages before this. We think that people have always had orphanages. Pagans didn't have orphanages. Muslims didn't have orphanages. It was the influence of Christ on people's hearts that created, because of mercy, because of kindness, because of the fruits of the Spirit, then we have orphanages. Now, they also had hospitals. And these hospitals were referred to as houses of the Holy Spirit. This is where people were taken and they were nursed back to health. Okay, they were treated. They were called houses of the Holy Spirit. And it was the Christians that started this. Interesting. Now, from the time of Jesus, Christianity has been associated with mercy and compassion towards all human life in practical, tangible ways. The two factors fighting against this influence have been neo-paganism and its veiled counterparts, materialism, humanism, and rationalism. While Christianity made compassion and the value of human life tenets of civilization, right, the Renaissance ushered a reviving of the old values, because in the Renaissance they started unearthing the ancient pagan ideals, and they brought out humanism and relativism and rationalism. Okay, by the 18th century, philosophers were attacking Christian presuppositions. Higher criticism and rationalism took hold. Kant, Hegel, et al. Began to slowly eat away at the foundations of Christian societal influence. From this arose Thomas Malthus and Charles Darwin, who in turn made way for the evils of the 20th century, including socialism and relativism. Gone were the underpinnings holding up the veneration of human life as unique among living creatures. In its place arose a pragmatism, with the health and life of the planet at its center. God's law played second fiddle to the relativistic platitudes of man. With Christianity's influence out of the way, blood of the innocents ran more freely once again. Purgings, genocides, gulags, and death camps followed. Sad, isn't it? In our own country, eugenics came to the forefront. In the name of the evolutionary ideal of survival of the fittest, people were involuntarily sterilized, and it happened a lot, with the black and the poor targeted for voluntary genocide. So anybody who was considered a negative for the gene pool was targeted for reproductive manipulation, so for birth control of all different types and for abortion. Okay, now you can research this yourself and you'll find out that it's true. All right. The most notable character of the interplay of this time was Margaret Sanger, who is credited with the founding of what we know today as Planned Parenthood. Right. Okay, most people know this. If you don't, it's very interesting, and we're going to dig into that, so be ready to be grossed out. Okay, I don't like sensationalizing, but I think it's important for us to dig deep here. I warn you that where we are going is dark, but I feel it is necessary in order to reveal just how godless, filthy, even demonic reproductive manipulation truly is. Okay, Margaret Sanger was the 6th child born to an Irish couple, the mother being Catholic and the father being a socialist atheist. As a young girl, she enjoyed a zest for spiritual things, but by the age of 17, she developed a hatred of the church. She was sent to a boarding school where she delved deeply into suffragette feminism, radical politics, and unfettered sex. Eventually, she married a wealthy man and lived comfortably, but lacked direction. As her husband became more involved in the radical political, socialist, anarchist, and communist movements meeting in Greenwich Village, and that's in New York City, Margaret found her life's motivation. She flung herself entirely into the causes of rebellion and revolution that were thriving at that time. This meant joining the one group unifying radicalism in the U.S., the Socialist Party. By 1912, the Socialist Party boasted 116,000 members and had elected 1,200 officials in 33 states and 160 cities, publishing over 300 periodicals. So we think that we got problems today, but that was the problem of the time. It was going crazy. It was spreading like wildfire. Okay. Now she fell, that's Margaret Sanger, fell under the influence of one Emma Goldman, a woman that with ties to radical groups around the world, and who traveled the country lecturing on the necessity of free love and the nobility of incendiary violence, as well as every other radical godless idea. She published the anarchist magazine Mother Earth and distributed leaflets on contraception and liberated sex. Now, contraception back then was pretty scary. Okay. Because of Goldman's influence, she began to follow the teachings of Havelock Ellis, a man who wrote the 7-volume Studies on the Psychology of Sex. So it was 7 volumes of that. Okay. Shortly afterwards, she told her husband she wanted an open marriage. And he wasn't for that. He was a radical socialist, but he didn't want an open marriage. Along the way, she was a regular participant in the discussions held at the Fifth Avenue apartment of one Mabel Dodge. Radical artists, writers, actors, and activists participated, and Sanger's discussions were always on sex. She spoke on, quote, romantic dignity, unfettered self-expression, and the sacredness of sexual desire, unquote. Yeah, so Margaret Sanger was really radically for open sex of any kind. All right. Dodge wrote of Sanger, Margaret Sanger was a Madonna type of woman who introduced us all to the idea of birth control, and it, along with other related ideas about sex, became her passion. She was the first person I ever knew who was openly an ardent propagandist for the joys of the flesh. And not long after this, she began publishing her own paper, that's Margaret Sanger, The Woman Rebel is the title. The slogan of this paper was, no gods, no masters. Okay. In her first issue, she called marriage a, quote, degenerate institution, unquote, and sexual modesty quote, obscene prudery, unquote. Now you can look up this magazine online. You can find this. This is not something I'm making up. It's not something that, is a conspiratorial, fairy tale. This actually is concrete. All right. She also wrote, quote, rebel women claim the right to be lazy, the right to be an unmarried mother, the right to destroy, and the right to love, unquote. Now, her periodical gave reason for her to be charged and arrested under the Comstock laws. The Comstock laws stated that you could not send anything obscene through the mail. All right. She decided to flee the country, but just before she left, she published the illegal leaflet entitled Family Limitation, which encouraged the use of Lysol douches, bichloride of mercury elixirs, heavy doses of laxatives, and herbal abortifacients as birth control methods. All right. She eventually landed in England, where she began to form ties with followers of Thomas Malthus. They were the Malthusians, then the Neo-Malthusians, whom we discussed in our previous videos on the subject. That we discussed Thomas Malthus, but by this time, the people who lived by his ideas, they had kind of grown and morphed a little bit. All right. The Malthusians of that time believed all the unfit must be removed to make way for the fittest. The unfit included the poor, the spiritually diseased, the racially inferior, and mentally incompetent. But they eschewed the more radical methods of pestilence and famine as agents. So Sir Thomas Malthus, he decided that the best thing to do was to let people die and encourage them to live in filthy conditions and to be promiscuous, so that everyone had venereal disease and became sterile. He wanted to encourage all that, and that way you would reduce the population, right? So, but they wanted to work differently. They wanted to use education, contraception, sterilization, and abortion. So that's where all that encouragement that we see everywhere comes from. It's actually from a Malthusian motivation. All right. Now, from there, Margaret also gleaned bits and pieces from the other Malthusian offshoots, including the eugenicists. Eugenics was big back then, and she was super involved. Okay. While in England, she practiced what she preached and liberally shared her bed, talking about unfettered sex and an open marriage. She shared a bed with H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw, and had a strange affair with Havelock Ellis, who was impotent but practiced other forms of sensuality. I told you it's gross, okay? I'm getting gross, but it's the truth. All right. And, I actually have printed off a short biography of Margaret Sanger from the Planned Parenthood site, and they talk about all these people. They have a list of all the people that influenced her, and they're the ones I'm reading to you now. So that's from Planned Parenthood itself. Havelock Ellis is considered the grandfather of the Bohemian sexual revolution. The list of his perverted sexual recommendations, about which he wrote numerous books, about each one, a book for each perversion, okay, is too provoking to write out here or to speak of here. He orchestrated orgies, lesbian affairs, and some involving his own wife, and established a network for homosexual and heterosexual encounters. He also experimented with mescaline and other psychotropic and psychedelic drugs. So this is something from Wikipedia describing who he was. Henry Havelock Ellis, 2nd February 1859 to 8 July 1939, was an English physician, eugenicist, writer, progressive intellectual, and social reformer, think about that, who studied human sexuality. He co-wrote the first medical textbook in English on homosexuality in 1897, and also published works on a variety of sexual practices and inclinations, as well as on transgender psychology. He developed the notions of narcissism and autoeroticism, later adopted by psychoanalysis. So he started a whole bunch of horrible things. Okay. Now, I'm sorry to drag you through this dark filth, but there is a reason for it. You see, it was this Havelock Ellis who helped Margaret Sanger to develop the strategy she used to alter the course of Western civilization. So the roots of Margaret Sanger, who is credited with starting Planned Parenthood. Her roots are filthy and dark and horrible. And we have to associate that because there's no getting away. If you read what she wrote, if you go through the whole thing, you'll find out that the roots of our reproductive rights, quote unquote, are very dark and very awful. Okay. Her past has been whitewashed so carefully that Planned Parenthood, thing I printed off, claims she was always against unnecessary abortions and fought to protect families. Yes, I know. They've rewritten it. What utter hogwash I have written here. Okay. I actually printed out her story, as I told you, and wow, they could really spin. Okay. They also downplay her connection to eugenics, saying everyone was a eugenicist back then. So they can't get away from the fact that she was a eugenicist. But they say, well, so is everybody else, and that's how they dismiss it. Okay. But they can't erase her own words and the actions which have been captured as public record. Here is a quote for you. Her ideals share a generous amount of common ground with the eugenics of Nazism, but more to the point, she expended a considerable amount of time and money towards making sure her eugenic ideals were implemented. The fact that she supported, collaborated, and promoted this abbreviated list of eugenicists, sympathizers, collaborators, and known members of Hitler's government, both before and after the Holocaust, renders her views more than merely insulting. Her organizing and propagandizing of eugenics was consequential enough to have made a difference in the way the eugenics movement evolved ultimately to light the fires of the Holocaust. And that's from a paper written by an A.E. Saman, and it's entitled Sanger and the Holocaust, and it was written in February of 2023. So, so you can find that online. I found it online. Okay. In her book, now this is a book that Margaret Sanger wrote, entitled The Pivot of Civilization, published in 1922, she brazenly called for the elimination of human weeds, that's what she called them, and suggested the ending of charity, as well as calling for the segregation of, quote, morons, misfits, and the maladjusted, unquote, for the sterilization of, quote, genetically inferior races, unquote. That's what she said. She wrote that in a book. You can't get away from it. All right. Just know this, that Sanger, through all of her pushing, shoving, and marrying into money, is the woman through whom legal oral contraception came into general use. And it is Margaret Sanger who is responsible for the organization which worldwide has committed more murder of human beings than any other single private organization in human history. I'm not talking about governments. I'm talking about private organization. They've murdered more people than anyone else. More important than all this, we all need to wake up to the immense influence Sanger and her ilk have had on our culture, especially as part of the Western Church. In the 20th century, barbarism has been cleansed. Instead of being associated with the dark, filthy ignorance of ancient paganism, murder has been recostumed and put in a brilliantly clean operating room attended by scientists and medical practitioners in white lab coats. In this environment, we listen to the priests wearing the mark of their PhDs and our prophets in the media who stand before the altar of our TV screens and declare to us the demands of our gods. Transgression has been redefined as anything that gets in the way of our self-actualization. Cross-carrying and self-denying are now considered sacrilege. We want none of that, just more of Jesus making our lives happy and comfortable without any sacrifice on our part. It's just the same old lies. And these lies never lead to satisfaction or purpose or long-lasting happiness and joy. But surrender to God does. And here's a scripture for you in Isaiah 55:9. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Here's another scripture in Isaiah 57:15. For this is what the high and exalted one says, He who lives forever, whose name is holy. I live in a high and holy place, but also with the one who is contrite and lowly in spirit, to revive the spirit of the lowly and to revive the heart of the contrite. Luke 17:33, Jesus said this, whoever tries to keep their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life will preserve it. Okay, it's a paradox. It's the paradox we hear when we hear the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi, the peace prayer. He said this, O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. I've taken a lot of this podcast from a number of different online sources, including Planned Parenthood's website, but mostly I've been blessed with information from George Grant's book, Grand Illusions, The Legacy of Planned Parenthood. And in my blog post, I linked to this book that you can find. It was very expensive, though. Okay, because it's out of print. Okay, a more modern version of this information, also by George Grant, is Killer Angel. Okay, and you can find that on Amazon, which is also a bit cheaper to purchase, and I think it was published in like 2020 or something like that. So Grand Illusions, George Grant has been amazing. This is so documented and footnoted. He has numerous sources for that information, so it's not made up. It's the truth. Okay, so this is really, really good. If you want to delve deeply, this is a really good book for that. Okay, now let me know what you think about this unit study for mommies. Yeah, this was a hard one. Are you taking notes? Maybe we should have a notebooking page contest for mommies about Margaret Sanger. I don't know. Do we want to do that? What do you think? And next time we will be talking about actually having the babies, as in, will we move in faith or listen to fear? And is there ever a time when you shouldn't have a baby? So we're going to talk about all that kind of stuff. And I hope that this has given you lots of food for thought. I hope that this spurs you on to do some research on your own. Maybe you can share some of this information with others, others that are just questioning things. They don't know what to think. And this is crazy times, right? It seems like a lot of times are crazy times, but this is really nutty. And we're all grappling with all these different ideas. Where does this type of thinking, where we think that it's important to have the freedom to choose to murder children, where did that come from? I think I've answered a lot of those questions, but you could look further into it and share this wide and far. Share it with your children as they grow and mature. Let them have a biblical worldview on where human beings come from. What is their purpose? Who should be in charge? Let's do our part in making sure that we spread the kindness, the mercy, the compassion of God that came through Jesus to others in a complete way. And also to encourage people to be willing to give of their lives and sacrifice themselves for the greater good. Okay, I think that's enough for today, don't you? Please like and subscribe and click all kinds of bells, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.